Hi, everyone. It's Kendall with Sager Family Farm again. Thanks for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about creating a pollinator paradise. So how we can create a wonderful garden to help support our little pollinators. Before I get started, I just wanted to go over some basics. So if you have any questions for me, you can ask them over here. Only I can see your questions, so no one else can see what you're typing. And also, you can see me, but I can't see you guys. So, and no one else can see you anyway. So, and then I will sometimes have questions for you, and they will pop up down here, and I'll let you know when I do have a question for you so you can participate as well. And I'll try to get to all of your questions at the end because it's a little hard to read and talk and show you guys pictures and videos at the same time. But I promise if you type something in there, I will get to it. I'll scroll through it at the end. So you can type it in so that you don't forget it at the very end either. So creating a pollinator paradise. Where do we start with that? So all animals and insects, they need to get food, water, shelter, and some safety from their environment. So we're going to be making sure that we provide all of these things. And today I'm going to be mostly focusing on bees, but a lot of these things help a lot of other pollinators like butterflies, hummingbirds, even some flies. Lots of different things will benefit from a lot of the stuff that we do for bees. So I think I'm going to start out with a question of food. So hang on just a second. And now there should be a question down here for you is, what type of food do bees collect from their environment? Do they collect honey from their environment? Do they collect pollen and nectar from their environment? Or do they collect leaves? So what in our garden do we need to provide for our bees so that they have enough food to live? So if you've watched some of my other classes, you might know the answer to this. And it looks like a lot of answers are coming in already. So I'm going to show you guys some pictures. Well, I'll give you a little more time to answer. So I'm going to pop up our first picture. And this little honeybee here, she is collecting nectar from her environment. So if you said that bees collect pollen and nectar from their environment and that is their food, you are correct. So this bee is a nectar collector, and this is what the pollen looks like when it's back in the hive. So the bees are also collecting and storing pollen. So all of these colorful little cells, some of them are red, some are orange, most of them are yellow. So it looks like they're finding lots of plants with yellow pollen in there. They're collecting the pollen, bringing it back to the beehive and packing it into their little cells. And right now it's called bee bread because they actually mix it with a little bit of nectar, and it becomes this kind of cakey, bready material that they feed to their young. So bees need both nectar and pollen. Their nectar, so if you were thinking maybe bees collect honey, nectar is dried out and turned into honey. So if bees cannot find food year-round, they rely on the honey that they've stored. Honey is really special in that it doesn't go bad, so they can store it for years and it is still good to eat. Whereas nectar is kind of like juice. And if I left a cup of juice out on the counter, I would not drink that after a week for sure. So the nectar has to be consumed more quickly unless it is turned into honey. So these are two things that we need to provide for our bees. But not all things produce nectar or pollen for the bees. So these ones are some nectar producing plants. So these plants only produce nectar. So I have some calamint with a little honeybee on it and some borage with a big black carpenter bee drinking some of that nectar. So these ones don't produce any pollen, but they're still good in my garden because they do produce nectar. In fact, borage actually refills with nectar every 5 minutes. So this one is very, very popular for bees. It also goes crazy in your garden. So these two plants provide only nectar. these plants, so this one is a wild lilac, that's that purpley flower. And then the white flower is yarrow, which is a California native plant. So this one goes really well in the environment where I am right now. But these two plants only provide pollen. So bees don't get nectar from either of these plants, but they do get pollen. So they're still really, really useful. And in fact, on the wild lilac, that's a honeybee. And on the yarrow, that is actually a sweat bee. So that is one of the solitary bees that lives here in California. And this one, it's actually a very tiny little bee. So these are actually tiny little yarrow flowers. There are actually about 1,600 different types of bee that live here in California alone. About 4,000 different species in the entire United States. So there's a lot of different kinds of little bees, and different bees favor different flowers. So I'm going to ask you guys another question while I show you some more plants, but let me get that one. Let's see. So can bees collect nectar or pollen from all flowers? So these ones only produce pollen, and the ones I showed before produce nectar. So they can collect nectar or pollen from all of those plants. But can they collect nectar and pollen from all flowers? So let's look at some more flowers. These flowers are really awesome flowers because they produce both nectar and pollen for the bees. So the little tiny purple flowers with the bright green leaves, that is a rosemary plant, and bees can collect both nectar and pollen from it. And I actually have a video of a bee collecting, actually both. I think she has a little snack on her way. So this bee, you can tell she's collecting pollen because she has these big balls of kind of whitish green pollen on her back legs. And she's also seeming to be interested in the anthers of the plant. So you can see her kind of brushing the tops of the flower, and that's so that she can collect the pollen. Every so often she does stick her face into the flower, and she's actually just getting a little nectar snack. So bees typically don't collect both nectar and pollen on one trip, but they will eat a little bit of nectar just to sustain themselves. So it looks like a lot of people answered, can bees collect nectar or pollen from all flowers? And it looks like a lot of people said, no, they cannot. And that is correct. So let me show you guys some flowers that bees do not really like. So oleander it's got these beautiful white flowers, but it actually doesn't produce any nectar for the bees. So sometimes oleander does trick a honeybee into pollinating it because it has these big, beautiful, showy flowers that are really attractive to bees, but they won't advertise to the rest of their beehive to go pollinate this because there's no reward. The bees do not collect the pollen, and they do not collect, there is no nectar to collect. So bees do not collect anything from oleander, and they don't really like this plant. So that's not a plant that I would want in my pollinator garden if I'm trying to create a pollinator paradise. The other thing, sometimes there's, I've got another picture of some fountain grass. So it's got these fluffy little tails all over it that kind of look like flowers, but bees don't get anything from grasses. So if we have a big lawn or some ornamental grass that might look really pretty, it'd look really great in our garden, but it wouldn't create a pollinator paradise because it's not providing any food for our bees. So the other thing we want to think about is, how do we provide food for our bees all year round? And let me ask you guys another question, and that is over here now. So how can we provide food for our pollinators all year round? And I'll talk about it a little in just a minute. But the options are, do we plant different kinds of plants? Do we plant lots of the same plant? Or can we put out some sugar water for them? So let's take a look at why we need to provide food all year round for our bees. So we'll take an apple, for example. So right now where I am in April, there are a lot of apple blossoms blooming. So there's flowers all over the place. There's no apples on my trees yet, but they're blooming. But in a few months, there are not going to be any flowers because that flower is going to be pollinated and it's going to start growing. So it's going to get little tiny apples that are going to be growing throughout the season. And then in about October, I'm going to be able to pick those apples. So my apple tree actually only blooms for about 1 month out of the entire year. And then it's using the rest of its energy to create apples. So there are no flowers on my tree for 11 months out of the year. So it looks like we have a lot of different answers of how can we provide food for our pollinators all year round. And the options were plant different kinds of plants, plant lots of the same plant, and put out sugar water for them. So planting a lot of the same plant. So if I had an orchard and all I had was apples, then for 11 months out of the year, my bees would have no food. So no bees would want to live there. So my pollinators don't like an environment with all the same plants. Honeybees do like big patches of the same plant because it can take them about 2,000 visits to flowers to fill up their nectar stomach before they go home. But when that plant stops blooming, there need to be other plants to provide food for it. Putting out sugar water. So sugar water, sometimes we put out sugar water for hummingbirds, like a little hummingbird feeder to attract them. Bees are sometimes attracted to that too. And some beekeepers actually do feed sugar water to their bees. But if I wanted to create a great pollinator garden, it's more nutritious for the bees to get their food from nectar and pollen than from sugar. Sugar doesn't have the same makeup as nectar, and nectar is much healthier for them. So I could, in a pinch, I could feed them sugar water, but it's not ideal, and it might end up attracting things that I don't want in my garden. So if I was putting out sugar water, I might attract ants or other things to my garden, which I don't really want there. So if you said plant lots of different kinds of plants, that is correct. But we have to have a strategy for planting lots of different kinds of plants. So let's take a look at some plants that bloom in the winter. So I want to make sure in all seasons I have something blooming. So if I only plant plants, like a lot of different plants, but they all bloom in the spring, then that's not really helping my pollinators. So I have to plant a lot of different plants that have different times that they bloom. So in my area in California, we have a very mild winter. So it probably gets to be about 50 degrees during the daytime, and that's about as cold as it might get. So we're lucky to have things that bloom in the winter. Other areas, pollinators might be hibernating, or with honeybees, they might be living off of their honey in the beehive. So these plants, rosemary, and broccolini or broccoli or anything in that kind of category, they can bloom in the winter. So I have a lot of these. And as an added bonus, they're actually both edible. So I really like having them in my garden because I can eat broccoli and I can also use rosemary to season a lot of my food. So now I need plants that bloom in the springtime. So since I'm in California, I choose some plants like the California native poppy is native here. So it does really well because the California poppy is from this area. So I'm trying to think about plants that grow really well where I am. So the California poppy is a great one that starts blooming in the spring. And there's a lot of different varieties of lavender, and bees love lavender, especially because that purple part that I think of as the flower is actually a bunch of little flowers all around. So each kind of little purple tuft on the side is actually its own flower. So the bees can get a lot of nectar from this plant. Then my summer plants, one that I really like to grow is sunflowers. So sunflowers attract all different sorts of bees. And actually, as you look at that sunflower in the middle, it's kind of the same as the lavender. Each seed is actually its own flower. Bees can collect both nectar and pollen from this. So this attracts a lot of different kinds of pollinators. So if you look closely on this picture, you can actually see, I think I see 3 different kinds of bees at least. So there's the tiniest bee is a sweat bee. It looks like there's kind of a medium bee in there that might be a leaf cutter bee. It's hard to see. She's facing away from us. And then there's a honeybee at the bottom. The other sort of flower that also blooms in the summer around here is a blanket flower. So it's this beautiful red flower with the little yellow tips. And that one also has a honeybee and a sweat bee on it. So these attract a lot of different types of bees as pollinators. And then to get all my bases covered, the winter, spring, summer, and fall blooming plants. Fall is one of the hardest seasons in California because it actually gets really hot and dry. So there's not a lot of water for our plants. So the pink flower that's blooming is sedum, which grows really well in our area. And then sage also grows really well. So this little honeybee, if we take a quick look at her, let me move where I am for just a second so that I can draw on top of this. So this little bee here, she's actually drinking from the flower strange way. You can see her tongue is right down here in the bottom when the opening of the flower is up here. So this sage plant is actually a really good plant for hummingbirds because they have really long beaks and they can reach into this flower. So this attracts hummingbirds pretty much year round. The honeybees aren't interested in it until the fall because it actually takes them some extra effort. So what this little honeybee is doing is she actually might have bit a hole at the bottom of the flower, right there where her tongue is, and right at the base so that her short tongue can reach the nectar because she doesn't have a long beak like the hummingbird does. So she can't reach in the way a hummingbird does. She has to cheat and bite a hole in one of the petals so that she can stick her tongue in. So that's why this is a really good drought tolerant plant, but the honeybee has to work a little harder for it, but there aren't very many fall blooming options for the bees. So she will make that extra effort for it. So the next thing that I like to provide for my pollinators, we've talked a lot about food, is they need both pollen and nectar, and they need it all year round. But then my bees also need water. And these are some options for providing water. But first, I want to ask you a question about why do bees collect water? Do they collect it to drink it? Do they collect it to water down thick honey? Do they collect it to cool down the beehive when it gets too hot? Or do they do all of these things? So why do bees collect water? And so here we can see that on the one side, the bees are on kind of a wet rock. And then they're just licking water off of that. So that's one way that bees collect water. So you might notice when it gets really hot, there's maybe some bees around your pool. And that's because we splash water out of the pool and they drink the water up from the side. They don't want to go in the pool. And that's because they don't like getting their feet as wet and they can't swim. So they don't like to be in the pool, but sometimes when they're kind of on the edge, if there's a little wave, they might get washed into the pool. So if they get into the pool, that's on accident. So the other way that I like to provide water is by doing this kind of a pet water fountain, but then putting rocks in the bottom so that the bees have something to stand on. So the water can go and fill it up and the bees can stand on a nice dry rock and then lick the water up. And I have a video of some bees drinking water so you can see them collecting it. So let's take a look at that. So here, these bees, this is kind of that pet waterer sort of situation. So there's a big reservoir, that yellow thing on the side, but then there's a little dish so that they can come to the edge and then they can suck up water and they can hold it in their nectar stomach just like they do nectar, and then they will bring the water back home. So looks like we got a lot of different answers. Is like, do bees drink the water? Do they water down thick honey? Do they cool down the hive with it? Or do they do all of the above? And the answer is they actually do all of the above. So they do need water to drink. So they do need some moisture. And times of the year where there is a lot of moisture, there's some wetness on plants, some dew in the morning. So when you walk out and your grass might be a little bit wet, or there's kind of this kind of glistening on a lot of the flowers, the bees can actually drink that. They also use it to maintain the consistency of honey. So if they dry out the honey too much, or if the honey crystallizes inside of the hive, they can actually consume the honey, mix it more with water, and regurgitate it to get it to be that really nice honey texture again. And then they also use it to cool down the beehive. When it gets really, really hot, it's kind of like how we sweat when we get too hot. So when we sweat, there's a little bit of water on our skin and it evaporates and that cools us down. So if the bees are too hot in the beehive, if it's 100+ degrees outside, they will collect water like crazy and put little drops of water all over the beehive and then fan their wings. And this is actually bee air conditioning. So that helps cool the beehive down. So bees really need water for a variety of reasons. So now let's take a look at providing some shelter for our bees. Let's see. So some shelter for our bees. Honeybees live in big wooden boxes and things like that, and are managed by beekeepers. But there's other types of bees that it would be more easy to provide shelter for in our own garden. For example, bumblebees like to live in old bird nests. So if you don't clean out your bird nest every year, so if you have a bird nesting box and a bird nests in there, sometimes if you leave it a little longer in the spring, a bumblebee might move in. So the queen bumblebee would say, hey, this looks like a great place to live. And then she'll start up a new beehive inside of there. And bumblebee hives are much smaller than honeybee hives. Honeybee hives are about the size of me if I was standing up. So they are pretty big. But a bumblebee hive is usually about the size of a birdhouse, so quite small. The other thing that you can provide for bees is shelter for solitary bees. So solitary bees, like that little tiny sweat bee that we saw on some of those flowers, they like to nest in little holes. And different types of bees like to nest in different materials. So in these two pictures, you can see that there are little tiny holes in wood. You can see that there's corks. You can see that there's pine cones. You can see that there's twigs. So there's a lot of different nesting material for the different bees. And I have a video of one of the bees that likes to use the nesting holes. So let's take a look at this little mason bee. So this mason bee, the reason why she's called a mason bee is she's collecting mud and closing up little cells in this hole. So each mason bee will only choose one tube, and that is her home. And then she kind of backs out when she's done. But the mason bee inside, let's take a look at what the different tubes look like on the inside. So on the inside, the bottom row is the mason bee. So she will make a little cocoon. She actually makes a little patty of pollen and nectar for her baby, lays an egg on it, and then closes up a wall with honey. And then that little egg hatches into a larva, eats the pollen and nectar, the patty that was made for it by its mother, and then it goes into a cocoon. So what we're looking at in there is all the little cocoons. But that mother mason bee protects each cocoon by sealing it with a wall of mud. In the middle row, this is a different type of bee that uses resin. So they actually collect tree sap and make a wall between each baby there. And then on the top row, it just looks like leaves. And that is a leaf cutter bee who collects leaves to make her nest. And I have a video of the leaf cutter bee, which is pretty cool, to show you guys how she makes her nest. So let's take a look at the leaf cutter bee.
Okay, this bee seems confused. That leaf she's gnawing on is no flower. But this is an alfalfa leaf-cutting bee. she needs hunks of leaves to build her nest. A lot of them. All this is her lacy handiwork. She hauls the pieces back home. Leafcutters use them to line the inside of their nest. In nature, she might use a nook and cranny in a log. But here, her nest is in what's basically a bee apartment building. A high-rise made of styrofoam. These markings help the bee find her way back to her personal condo. You know, like 7B.
So that is how the leafcutter bee uses leaves. So we can provide shelter by making a native bee hotel. So all of those little tubes, we can set up a little bee house for them. We should also make sure they have something to wall off their cocoons. So if we were doing mason bees, we would want to make sure there's a really almost like a clay, like mud. So it should be the texture of Play-Doh, so really squishy mud. So in most places, the mason bees come out in the springtime when it's really, really wet. So we don't really see them in the summertime as much because the soil dries out and then they don't have any nesting material. So those little cocoons stay put until the next spring when they emerge out and then start their own nests. The leaf cutting bees go into the summer because they have more available nesting materials. So that wild lilac that I showed you at the very beginning, that's a really good pollinator source for the bees, that is also a good source for the leaf cutting bees. They can cut the leaves and use it for their nesting material. So we want to make sure that our pollinator paradise has food for our bees, has water for our bees, has shelter for our bees, and the last thing is safety. And safety, their shelter can provide them safety, but the other things that we can do to provide them some safety is by making sure we're not putting anything bad for the bees in the environment. So if I'm using pesticides to keep my flowers looking really beautiful, pesticides kill the bad bugs, but they don't know the difference between bad bugs and good bugs. So they would also kill my pollinators in most cases. So I want to make sure to keep things that are bad for my pollinators out of my garden to help keep them safe too. So that's how I would create a pollinator paradise, is by creating food, water, shelter, and safety for all of my pollinators. And now I'm going to take a look over here and see what kind of questions you guys have. Let's see. Oh, it looks like some of you guys saw a native bee today and might have some hummingbird feeders. So it sounds like you guys might have some pollinator paradises nearby. And I've got another question. How long is a hummingbird's beak? And you know, I don't know that off the top of my head, and it's something I'm going to have to look up. It's certainly longer than a honeybee's tongue, though, which is why they are looking for different flowers than maybe the honeybees are, which is why it's also important to have a lot of different types of flowers, because the different types of flowers attract different bees and different pollinators. So some plants that are too long for the little short honeybee tongue might attract a butterfly really nicely. The other cool thing that might attract butterflies to your garden would be to have a host plant for the caterpillars. So something like here in California, I like to have milkweed for monarchs, because the milkweed, the monarchs can lay their egg and then they eat the leaves. And it's one of the only plants that they eat, is one of our native milkweeds. And then that plant, that milkweed, also provides nectar for the monarchs and for the honeybees. So that is a really cool way to attract some butterflies. And let's see, why do bees only eat nectar and honey? I don't know why they eat only those two things, but different insects eat different things to survive. So honeybees can get all of the nutrients that they need from nectar and pollen. So pollen is a protein source. So I might get protein from maybe meat that I eat, from nuts, and even from dairy. So I might get some protein from those things that I eat, but bees are getting all of their protein from pollen. And then they get an energy source, so something that I might get from sugars or carbohydrates, so something like bread. They are getting those sugars from nectar. And it's actually important for them to have a variety of nectar, because asking them to only drink nectar from one flower or eat pollen from one plant would be kind of like asking us to choose one food and then only eat that food. So different nectars and different pollens have different qualities. So it's kind of like them eating like a sandwich or a hot dog. So the different flowers actually produce different things that help keep the bees healthy. So even though they're only eating pollen and nectar, the variety of pollen and the variety of nectar that they collect help keep them really healthy. Let's see. It looks like I have gotten through all of the questions. You guys have some great questions, and thank you guys so much for tuning in to learn how to create a pollinator paradise. If you have any other questions, you can ask them after I sign off, or ask your parents to email me those questions. Thank you so much, and have a good one. Bye.